Yeah, okay. We're recording?
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody. Very nice to see you. And great to be back for our July meeting. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're all on traditional lands and that we're on the land of the Gadigal people tonight. I'd like to recognise the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, their ongoing connections to lands, water, and culture, and to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and also extend that respect to other Aboriginal people on the call today. We're excited about two terrific guests this evening. We're going to hear from Mullen, the CEO of the Superpower Institute, speaking about the case for pricing pollution, reducing emissions, strengthening the economy, and delivering a fairer share for Australians. And then from Tom Woodruff, who's the author of the recently published book, Power, Prosperity and Planet, Climate and Energy Policy for All.
great. And as we've been doing just the last few months, we thought might just sort of summarize a few of the sort of environment achievements that have been happening over the last month since we last caught up. So I thought I'd just go through. Carol and I were chatting about some of these. We just mentioned a few of these. Some of them you might be across. No particular order, but it was interesting that battery EV sales in Australia were 23.5% of all new car sales in June, and they were mainly Tesla and BYD, I think, were leading. And then when you also count in hybrids, that number came to just under 50% in June, which is amazing. And I think in the ACT, EVs had 43% new sales in June, so it's amazing too. As we've just been speaking, the Europe and the UK experiencing another heat wave. So Western Europe just had its hottest June on record. And Europe is experiencing the impacts of climate change at roughly twice the speed as expected. And interestingly, we did a session back in February with Ollie J talking about heat and human health. So again, very relevant back then. Also in recent news, I think this was in the AFR or the Financial Times, Europe's low electrification rate, so approximately 23%, which is holding back competitiveness and economic sovereignty. Europe's Energy Commissioner, Dan Jorgensen, said that Europe needs to electrify faster after two energy crises in less than 5 years, and obviously being hit by the global disruption with oil and gas. And electrification in Europe has stagnated in the last decade. So I think they're trying to address that. They've got a plan coming out to boost incentives and reduce costs of electrification. And some renewables have been built yet, but they're in the queue for grid connection. So it's been slow updating the grid capacity. Also, in the last month, we heard about Community Strong Australia. So that's the news that Zali Steggall and Allegra Spender have joined forces to create a new party. Many of you will have seen Zali on quite a few of our calls over the years, speaking to our group. And also, given that both Zali and Allegra are current independent MPs who are climate action focused, obviously very hardworking, very capable and constructive, we're really hopeful about this move as well. So if you want to find out more about that, please do let Carolyn and I know, because we can definitely share further information on that as well. And then I also thought I might just mention, I noticed today there was an article in the Financial Times that was headlined. We're just chatting about it with Tom there. Australians going gangbusters on Chinese batteries in renewable energy shift. So I'll post that to our WhatsApp group, but it mentions Tim Buckley quite a lot, from who's part of our group. And I like the quote at the end. He said, basically, solar ate coal's lunch and now batteries are eating gas's dinner. So that was pretty good. Okay, so we'll jump into today's session. I'm just going to now introduce Beathan Mullen. So Beathan, absolutely delighted that you could join us. Beathan, as Carolyn said, is the CEO of the Superpower Institute, and he's going to talk about the case for pricing pollution, reducing emissions, strengthening the economy, and delivering a fair share for Australians. Just a bit of background on the Superpower Institute. It was founded in 2023 by renowned economist Ross Garnaut and public policy expert Rod Sims. It's a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to helping Australia seize the extraordinary economic opportunities of the post-carbon world. and their focus is to support Australia to become a major exporter of renewable energy and green industrial products, and also to elevate Australia's economic and climate ambition and secure our place as a leader in a decarbonised global economy. Beethan brings over 2 decades of experience in public policy, economics, and regulatory affairs. He's held senior leadership roles across federal, state, and not-for-profit sectors, with expertise in energy, regulatory affairs, and economics. He started out as a lawyer, then Beethan spent much of his career in a variety of roles at the ACCC, and he's been executive director of Victoria's Essential Services Commission and joined the Superpower Institute as CEO 2 years ago. He's going to chat for approximately 20 minutes and then we'll have Q&A. So please do pop any questions in the Q&A as we go and we'll then come to them. So welcome, Beethan, and thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks very much, Stephen and Carolyn, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm joining from traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to them uh, as well. As I said, it's a great pleasure to join you. I have some slides which I'll talk through tonight, and very happy to take questions at the end. I think this is a topic that prompts a lot of questions from people generally, so I'm hoping that there'll be some good engagement at the end of it. And I should also say, I think this initiative, Professionals for Climate, this is the first time I've encountered it, but it sounds like a fantastic initiative. And I think we do a lot of our work directly engaging with government and businesses, but I think grassroots kind of efforts are really crucial to the progress we make on climate change. And you have my full support in the efforts that you're putting into it. All right, I'll just get the slides up. Just hold on a moment. Hopefully this works. Is that coming through okay? If somebody can give me a thumbs up. Excellent. All right. So the work I'm going to present to you tonight is, as Stephen mentioned, the case for pricing pollution. We released this at the end of January this year. It's somewhat provocative piece of work, I must say. Carbon pricing in Australia has a bit of a checkered history, as many of you will know. But we really think the time is right to revisit this topic and to kick this ball back into play and have a good discussion about it. So that's what motivated the work. And we have a detailed piece of analysis and research on our website that I'd encourage anyone interested to go and have a look at afterwards. I'll share a QR code at the end so you can locate that easily. Stephen's done a great job of introducing who we are, so I won't dwell on this, and I've only got 20 minutes. We're a not-for-profit. We focus on really the economic narrative around Australia's role in global decarbonisation. Just to spend a couple of minutes talking about what that means. I'm often get asked, what does the Superpower Institute, what does superpower mean? There are three principles that this is based on, really. The first is that our analysis and research shows that most major economies will lack enough cheap and clean energy to meet their future needs. Think about a world where most forms of energy use are electrified. We've got economic development occurring in many parts of the world. We will exhaust the opportunities to produce solar power and wind energy cheaply in many parts of the world. And that creates both a gap but also an opportunity. Due to the prohibitive cost of transporting renewable energy and hydrogen, the trade in energy in future will be in embedded clean energy, and that's what we describe as products that have energy embodied in them, and we call these the superpower industries or superpower products. So these are commodities that have been processed with renewable energy, so zero or low carbon production method, and by doing that, you can displace the use of fossil fuels in traditional industrial processes. And the third principle is that Australia has a very large comparative advantage here in clean energy production, and we can take up a large share of that international trade, which is both an economic opportunity and a large potential contribution to global decarbonisation. I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are several different superpower commodities that we talk about and we do research about. You can find out more about these on our website. And again, this is the basis for Australia's role here. We have world's best solar and wind, vast land areas, excellent industrial capacity, critical minerals, etc. Again, you can find out more about all of this on our website. And this is the contribution. This is kind of the punchline. Our analysis shows that Australia can contribute between 7 and 10% of reduction in global emissions. That's global emissions if we maximize the superpower opportunity by 2060. So it's a really large contribution. If you put it into context, Australia is about 1% of global emissions. So a really outsized role that Australia can play by acting in this area. All right, I'm going to move on to the piece of work in focus today. It is motivated by three big policy problems in Australia. We're not reducing emissions fast enough. We have a weak budget, and we face some long-term economic challenges, mainly related to productivity. And the package of solutions and the two policies in particular seek to address these three problems. This chart shows our historical emissions trajectory from 2005 to present, and then some straight lines to our targets in 2035. And as you can see, if you take the current trajectory based on historical reductions, we're going to overshoot or under-deliver on our emissions reductions by quite a margin. That's both our 2030 target and then our 2035 targets by an even larger gap. And the pale blue line on that chart is a 1.5 degree warming trajectory. So we're just not even in the ballpark at the moment in terms of Australia doing our role in emissions reduction to get to both our targets and ideally a 1.5 degree trajectory. So we've developed this policy which we call a polluter pays levy. It is a polluter pays tax on carbon emissions, and it's distinguished from other forms of carbon price or carbon tax you would be familiar with in other contexts. So Australia has previously had an emissions trading scheme. There's an emissions trading scheme in Europe. This is a bit different. What we have tried to do is to simplify things substantially by targeting fossil fuel production upstream and also imported fossil fuels into Australia. And what that does is it allows you to target a much smaller number of firms, businesses, companies who would actually pay the tax. With an emissions trading scheme or even the current system, the safeguard mechanism, there is a very broad imposition of those taxes because every business who meets a certain threshold has to pay the tax. We're trying to flip that on its head, and by levying the tax upstream, you can limit it to about 140 fossil fuel extraction sites, which is under 50 companies in Australia. It would also include the importation of petrol and diesel, and by doing this, you can cover about 80% of emissions, which is much, much larger than current coverage. We deliberately decided to exclude fossil fuel produced for export. The reason for that is twofold. One is we found that would have a very significant impact on price of those commodities, coal and gas, and our trade partners would quite likely switch to other sources of finding those products. The second reason is we're in a delicate geopolitical climate, for want of a better word, at the moment, and relationships with our trade partners are important, and we need to transition our relationships with those trade partners from the legacy fossil fuel trade to the new energy trade and the superpower trade. And we want that to be a productive transition and a smooth as possible transition. We feel like if we add a tax to our products, that's going to be a pretty blunt way to start that transition. We would start the levy at $17 a tonne. It would increase to meet the EU price from 2034, and follow the EU price from then. It had delivered $22.5 billion in revenue on average over the next 25, 30 years. Levying a tax in this way is economically efficient. So without wanting to bore you with the economic theory, when you tax something that is bad, like emissions, that is one of the more efficient ways that you can raise revenue. It is because it's a broad price, it reduces emissions at lowest cost and it raises revenue efficiently. And it also aligns the investment signals with net zero. So investment in renewable energy and industries that are powered by renewable energy will be incentivized, and those that are polluting will be disincentivized. It's simple and transparent to implement, hard to evade, and simple because of the revenue raised to compensate households. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is the chart that shows the impact on emissions reduction. So I said earlier that our trajectories are not good, not looking good at the moment. We're going to miss our targets by a long way. This chart shows that after 10 years of operation, we could reduce emissions by an extra 100 million tonnes each year. So that's 2036. 100 million tonnes is a huge amount. If you can see, we're at about 400 million tonnes at the moment. So we're reducing it by about a quarter after 10 years just by using this policy. I said a return to compensation for households. This is, we think, a really critical part of both the story, the selling of the policy, but also just in terms of being fair to households and consumers. So we've designed two components to this. Each is worth about $4 billion per year through to 2050, funded by the proceeds of the polluter pays levy. The first part is an energy compensation payment, which would go to all households in Australia. And it would be compensation sufficient to insulate households from higher energy prices. So the households, when you net out the compensation payment, would be no worse off on average. The second component is a targeted payment, also around 4 billion, but targeted to the lower income households who are more exposed to energy price increases and have less ability to put solar on their roofs, buy batteries, etc. And that payment would become more targeted over time. The implication of this package is that initially nearly all the revenue is recycled back to households. And over the first decade, about half the revenue goes back to households. So it's not in the early years or over the first decade motivated by raising revenue for the government. It is motivated by shifting the investment signal to sources of clean energy and making sure that households aren't any worse off through any impact on energy prices. But over time, it will leave billions of dollars for other pressing needs that the government has, budget repair, and policies that we know need attention, tackling barriers to household electrification, all of those sorts of things. The second part of the package that our work covers is what we've called a fair share levy. And the motivation for this is different to the emissions role. Really, the bottom line is Australia does not retain a fair share of our fossil fuel profits at the moment. And this chart just shows a comparison. It's a kind of league table compared with other major fossil fuel producers around the world. The dark portion of the chart shows the tax rate, and the light part of the chart shows ownership, returns to the government through ownership. And you can see that Australia sits dead last on that table, where even worse than the United States, but pretty close to the United States. But the average level of taxation by fossil fuel producing countries is more like 75% on average. Some of them up to 100% or close to it, certainly over 80% in places like Norway. So we've designed what we call a fair share levy. This form of taxation is a fairly technical way to raise revenue, but the existing form of resource rent taxation in Australia, which is called the petroleum resource rent tax, is also quite complex. This seeks to replace that, but to do so more effectively, to raise the revenue that would come back to Australians in a more direct way. So it is what we describe as a two-way structure. That means that the government contributes both to losses and profits from the project. That is particularly important because it creates an economic neutrality that means you don't distort investment decisions or prices. It would apply to gas producers undertaking exploration, extraction, or liquefaction of gas. The rate would be 40%, and the corporate tax would be deductible from that, which means an effective combined rate of about 58%. So if you think going back to this chart here, 58% would still put us at the bottom of that table, but would be a huge improvement from where we are now. Sorry, gone the wrong direction there. The revenue raise would be $13 billion on average. As I said, the design of the tax is that it's economically neutral, doesn't affect prices or incentives to invest, but it's fair. It means that gas reserves, which are owned by the public, in essence, we start to get a fair return on that ownership. The companies will continue to profit, but they will return a greater share to Australians. The problem is at the moment, society bears the cost of those emissions and doesn't get any of the benefits, or a very small share of the benefits. This chart just shows the revenue implications over time. So $35 billion on average over time returned to the government. It peaks at over 40 billion there for quite a long stretch, and then declines towards the end as the price impact and the decline of fossil fuel use in Australia and around the world kicks in. And this is really just a summary of what it all adds up to in terms of revenue, in terms of the compensation that would flow to households, and the emissions reductions compared with 2005. And that's about 67% reduction in emissions compared with 2005 levels. The final point I want to make is that, contrary to what some people believe, a polluter pays levy or a form of tax like this is broadly popular. We commissioned research in the lead up to publishing our work that asked the polled people whether they agree with the statement that Australia should introduce a pollution levy on the country's 100 biggest polluting companies. 68% agree, and other polls show similar numbers. Around 70% is a common number here. We also had crosstabs that looked at this by different voter groups. Surprisingly, it's quite robust to different political affiliations or voting intentions. It's not as strong with some, but it's still positive, which is, we think, an important result, because there is a bit of a narrative out there that carbon pricing is unpopular and impossible to adopt because a government would suffer some political consequences. The second panel here shows that on the question polled, whether there was agreement with Australians deserving a better return on the sales of our resources like coal and gas exports, even higher levels of support, 87%. Again, robust to different demographics and across political parties. Interestingly, even higher support among One Nation voters we found, which we thought was quite interesting. So yeah, again, just want to sort of end on that note that sometimes when we talk about policies like these, there's a nervousness that there's not it's not politically possible to visit these kinds of policies because of a perception that they are unpopular and that governments who consider them will be subjected to political damage. We say that's not the case, certainly not the starting point for the discussion, and we should be able to have discussions about these policies in a reasonable and fact-based way, knowing that we're starting from a position of strength in the population.
Thank you,
That's
Ethan.
the end.
Yeah,
I'll
excellent.
just pause on that QR code if anyone wants to look up the work. But yeah, happy to take questions.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks so much, Ethan. That's really interesting. So, maybe if you want to stop sharing, and we'll just sort of go to the screen. So I suppose, yeah, pop your questions in the chat. First one to you, I suppose. I mean, in terms of next, that sounds pretty clear and well laid out and everything. So, what's next steps, do you think, from your side?
Well, the short-term next step is that this year the government will review the safeguard mechanism, which is in effect, the emissions reduction policy that applies to the largest industrial emitters in Australia. That review, most people are expecting, will kick off in the middle of the year, and it will ask the question whether the safeguard mechanism should be adjusted in some way to make emissions reductions more effective. We say we should ask a broader question and ask whether the safeguard mechanism is the right mechanism, the right policy to help reduce our emissions. We would like to see that on the table, that question asked, and a broad consideration of different kinds of policies, including the one we've put forward, to assess whether we can be more effective, more efficient at reducing emissions over the next couple of decades in Australia. I don't know whether that will be what the government decides to do. They've been pretty committed to the safeguard mechanism for a while.
Mhm.
But interestingly, I think one thing that has happened recently is the safeguard mechanism to this point had effectively bipartisan support. And one of the reasons for retaining it and sticking to this model was both sides of politics had lived with it, and it was even, I think, a Liberal Party invention to begin with. So we're now in a situation where the coalition has said they will abandon the safeguard mechanism if elected, and I think that really undermines the argument that we should stick with a flawed policy because it had bipartisan support. We might as well ask what's the best policy to achieve our objectives.
Yeah, thanks very much. And in terms of, any sort of feedback from government so far on what you're proposing?
Um, I think in a lot of private conversations, we get positive reactions. Certainly within agencies like Treasury, we know there is a fundamental level of agreement with what we're saying. With the government itself, I think, as I said, there's a reluctance to revisit these issues. There's still some scar tissue from the debates of the past. What we're trying to do is put forward the case to say that you need not be so afraid. But as of yet, I haven't seen indications that we've won that debate.
Mm.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, there's quite a few pay the rent type campaigns out there at the moment, around, I suppose, taxing fuel that's going to be exported.
Mhm.
How do you kind of see these options and themes working with some of the other campaigns that are out there?
Yeah, so our fair share levy is the equivalent policy in that space. The first point we would make is that either of those models, a 25% export tax or our policy, would be better than what we have now. It would be more effective at raising revenue and deliver a greater level of fairness than the system we have now. We say our policy has some advantages. I spoke about the trade relationships, the impact on investment and prices. A lot of us in this room might think and agree that higher gas prices and less investment in the gas industry not a bad thing. That might be true from a macro perspective, but in terms of navigating the transition to net zero and our trade relationships with important partners like Japan and Korea, I think it's a little more complex. So we say our model is going to be more effective at navigating some of those challenges, and for that reason, it should be preferred.
Yeah, thanks, both. And that sort of ties into, we'll go through some of the questions here. So Craig's asked, how do you get around commercial contracts that have been signed? Is that a problem?
Yeah, so I assume that relates to the gas tax
Mm.
concept. We have included in our proposal a transition mechanism that would um, effectively square up with the gas companies uh, to create a way that joins the past to the future model in a way that balances fairness and a need to deliver some revenue to the government. So there's details on that in the paper if you want to read more about that.
Yeah.
It's good to hear that you've thought through some of those, um, the typical kind of roadblocks that are put
Yeah,
in
I think
play.
I think we don't want to fall at the first hurdle here.
Mm.
If there are good arguments against what we're putting forward, then we wanted to meet those head on, and we feel like we've done that.
We'll go back to the questions in the chat in a minute, but how do you feel it's been going socializing there? Because it's obviously a lot of work that you've put in before you've started sharing the policies. How's it been going?
Yeah, there was probably 3 or 4 months of quite intense efforts to socialise the work, to brief government departments and members of the government, other MPs and their officers, business groups. The energy sector is very interested in this area as well. So that was quite an intense effort earlier this year and at the end of last year. Um, we think that's gone very well. There is a broad agreement and understanding that emissions reductions is hard, and we should do it in the lowest cost way we can, the way that is going to preserve economic activity, going to grow our areas of strength in Australia, create new jobs, all of those things, and help with the budget situation in a way that the current set of policies won't be able to do. We think we've got, quite good traction with that amongst the groups that we've spoken to. It always falls back to, is this politically achievable and politically possible? And I think uh, it's one of those situations where it's not evident that it's possible until it happens, because
Mm.
until it does happen, the default way of thinking is it can't happen. And so we've got to break through in some way to have someone courageous enough to put this on the table and have an open discussion about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a perfect segue to Stefan's question in the chat. Outside of fossil fuel producers, who would be negatively impacted by this policy?
Yeah, there would be, I think, certain types of businesses that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels. I should say I focused on household compensation in the presentation. We also have an extension of small business energy relief in the package as well, but I didn't cover that here. But if you're a business that burns a lot of natural gas or burns a lot of diesel fuel, those products would be subject to these levies, and you would be facing higher prices. So for businesses that don't have a pathway to transitioning to a cleaner version, I think it is the case that they are going to face a difficult future. That is the case, though, whatever emissions reduction policy we decide to adopt.
Mm.
We are not we are not saying this is a choice between doing what we're suggesting or doing nothing. The government has set itself targets. We have commitments internationally. We have to meet these objectives one way or another. And so what we're saying is let's do it in the most efficient way possible. Let's not create inefficiencies that are going to make this harder than it needs to be.
Mm.
Yeah, very interesting. Just bringing in a couple of questions from Martin here. I think, Martin, yeah, I think that was 2025, the first part of your question. The second, um, on the 4.1 billion return to people to balance energy shocks, would that not go to companies like AGL, etc.?
It would be paid to households as an annual check or twice yearly check. So it would be up to households how they choose to spend that. So if you're using a given amount of electricity and you get a check for $1,000, yes, you can use that to pay your energy bill, or you might choose to put it towards some solar panels or a battery in a way that reduces your reliance on that energy source that is now subject to a tax. So what economics would say is that there'll be some stimulation of action by households and consumers that will incentivize the kinds of things we need to take place to decarbonize in a way that doesn't mean there'll just be exactly the same thing happening and recycling the money back to fossil fuel producers.
That's a good consideration. Mix asked, have you or the Institute spoken directly with any of the community independents in Parliament? And if yes, what was their response?
We have, and I would say that that they should each speak for themselves, but I think it was a good discussion. It broadly reflected what I said earlier about we've had a good hearing with most people we've spoken to about this. The logic is understood, and that was the same with the community independents.
That's good.
Yeah. And then Craig's also asked just around, from a macroeconomic impact of the petrodollar economy, just, what's the reaction likely to be, internationally to this?
Uh, Good question. We I referred to the trade relationships and dynamics. I think there is a heightened level of concern about Australia doing something like a 25% gas export tax, and uh, I would say that there's probably some quite strong lobbying by our trade partners and companies in Asia against the Australian government adopting that policy. Um, what we have tried to do is design something that is more neutral or is neutral. And we think that is a selling point because the same arguments that can be made against a 25% tax can't be made against a fair share levy. So sometimes these arguments get blurred and all sort of policies get tarred with the same brush. We're doing what we can to try and distinguish ourselves to make it clear that the downsides of a 25% tax don't apply to our model.
And we'll take one final question, which has come into the chat from Jill before we move on. Jill's just asked, have you had any interest from the ALP, from the Lean group, or the 8 climate champions?
Yeah, we have had good engagement with Lean, and in fact, we are doing a fringe event with Lean in Adelaide in a couple of weeks. So, talking about these policies. So,
Right.
yes.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, fantastic. And in terms of, our group and others like us, what can we do to support you in this?
I think the main thing that you can do is promote awareness of this kind of work in your networks and in the discussions you have with family and friends, your interactions with your members of parliament and those who are standing for parliament, I think is really important as well. Um, we need to win the discussion around this being a politically possible pathway we can take. And the more that that is heard from the grassroots level, I think the more likely we are to succeed.
Yeah,
That's
fantastic.
great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bethan.
Thanks, Pathan. We could
Thank
have
you.
probably kept talking for another same again. It's really interesting. There's obviously so much work that's gone into all the policies, and congratulations on what you've done so far. And yeah, I think we're looking forward to helping spread the word. Spread the
Really
message.
appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So much.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Tom Woodruff, the author of the recently published book, Power, Prosperity and Planet, Climate and Energy Policy for All. Just a little bit about Tom to introduce him. He's been involved with UN climate talks for some time, including the 2015 Paris Agreement. He's previously worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, including for former PM Kevin Rudd in his capacity as ambassador to the United States. He's worked with Rohingya leaders and refugees from Myanmar, helping secure a UN investigation and targeted sanctions, and recently been a senior international fellow with the Smart Energy Council. His professional work focuses on climate, clean energy, and green metals diplomacy, especially given Australia's role having the presidency with Chris Bowen having the presidency of the COP31 negotiations. So, Tom, thank you for joining us. We're really looking forward to hearing more. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen and Carolyn. Really, really delighted to be here. Impressed at the roll-up on a Monday night. And the amount of members that you have. And I was quite touched by the background of this group coming out of the bushfires, it sounded like, in early 2020. So kudos to all of you. Also just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where I am, and also just wanted to acknowledge Baith, and particularly if he drifts off to go to bed in the next half hour. He's heard my spiel a number of times. He was kind enough to be at my book launch in Melbourne. But the Superpower Institute is a seriously great treasure of Australia's public debate and intellectual rigour. And the reason I say that without any vested interest is when I wrote my little book, there's no group or set of experts that I quote more than the Superpower Institute, and not just their founder in Ross Garnaut, but a whole bunch of Baith and staff. So I really commend you to them. I think they're forward-leaning in understanding the debates as they're coming, which we've seen, for example, through the two proposals that he just put up on the screen. And they do it in a way that is really rigorous and serious, and doesn't fall into kind of gotcha politics, which I think distinguishes the regard with which so many hold them in Canberra especially. Anyway, I don't propose to talk for too long, but what I thought I'd do is give you a little bit of a sense of my background beyond what Carolyn said, tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book, and then tell you a little bit about what the book actually says. As Carolyn says, I've spent about the last 15 years working in international climate and energy policy. But I did that as someone who grew up in country Victoria, and actually grew up completely without any, or off the grid entirely, but with no regular electricity source for the first 16 years of my life. And when I turned 16, the introduction in this country of the first subsidies for solar power had quite a revolutionary impact on my life, because it meant for the first time that if I flicked the light switch on the wall, immediately the light would turn on thanks to a solar and battery system, and a generator wouldn't spur into motion, which had very limited capacity and meant quite a different upbringing to a lot of my people my age growing up at the time. I spent about half that time working on international climate and energy in the oddly named UNFCCC process, which stands for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the annual negotiating process that culminates towards the end of the year with the annual COP meeting, Conference of Parties, which Australia has a lead role in this year. And part of that I spent as an advisor to the president of the Marshall Islands, which is one of the lowest lying countries in the entire world. It's made up of coral atoll, so there is literally no higher ground, which was a role I really kind of fell into, in fact, in my early 20s. But it was such a profound apprenticeship in life, because it meant that I was one of the most senior diplomatic advisors to the head of government at a very, very young age, who obviously didn't have a lot of power, but they did have a lot of moral power and a lot of moral leadership. They were doing everything they can to or could to reduce their own emissions, as minuscule as they were. But they were also playing a really outsized impact in the actual technical negotiations, so bringing constructive ideas to bear. And one thing I talk about a little bit in the book is if you look at the Paris Agreement and a lot of the elements of it, which we sort of take for granted these days, including the fact that we have a sort of long-term goal which manifests itself around the world as a net zero goal, 142 countries committed to it. The fact that we have commitment periods of 5 years, so countries, including Australia, set their targets every 5 years. Even the fact that we had a scientific investigation into 1.5 degrees being the sort of yardstick of what's considered safe. All of those ideas actually were proposals first inserted into the negotiating text by the Marshall Islands, as one of the smallest countries in the world. So it was quite an extraordinary experience. About the other half of those 15 years I spent as Chief of Staff to Kevin Rudd, both at the Asia Society and then back in government at the Embassy in Washington, where besides doing a whole bunch of things, including busting Assange out of jail and getting to know the Trumpies, it also meant we did quite a lot of work behind the scenes with China, which obviously is the biggest panda in the room when it comes to the challenge that we're all talking about. But the reason I wrote the book was we just moved back to Australia a couple of months ago, actually, after spending most of those 15 years overseas. And as I increasingly came back to Australia last year for a whole bunch of reasons, a couple of things really struck me about the debate in our country. One was that I didn't feel that the arguments for action on climate and energy were necessarily resonating as much as we all think they should. And when I say we, I refer collectively to the climate and energy community in Australia, of which I would count all of us as part of that, by the way, if we're showing up at 8:49 on a Monday night to talk about it. And as a result of that, I also think, or part of the reason for that, is that we're also leaving quite a few people behind in this transition already. And that runs a real risk because it means that we don't achieve ultimately a just transition in this country. And the reason that I think it's not quite resonating is that sometimes, we start the debate in the wrong place. And I say this as criminal number one when it comes to articulating often this in the wrong way, which is we start with things like the Paris Agreement. We start with the legal imperatives. We start with the moralizing and the science. And what we don't start with is just what matters to people here and now, or a lot of people here and now, which is often the economy or their hip pocket or their own lived circumstance, and how you can actually make climate and energy work for them. Make it an economic question, not out into the future, but here and now. And the second big reason I wrote the book was it struck me that Australia has some huge challenges ahead of it, bigger than I think we often comprehend in our national debate. And, this is another reason why the Superpower Institute is so important, because it's one of the few institutions actually in this country that's progressing this debate. But, in 1964, Donald Horne called Australia the lucky country. And he actually, for anyone that knows their history, he was actually being ironic. He was saying Australia is lucky despite the quality of its political leadership. And it's lucky because it's a long way from trouble spots. It's got a bounty of resources below its feet. And all of these reasons. But the point I'm making is that this time around, our challenges are so profound that luck alone will not be able to solve them. And the biggest one that I talk about in the book, which is why there's prosperity in the name, and which Bathen's whole institute is based on, is the point that in the next 20 or 30 years, Australia's economy is going to radically transform, whether we like it or not. And it's going to radically transform because our second and third largest exports are fossil fuels. They're coal and gas. Our largest export is iron ore, where we can actually extract more from the chain from by being able to produce things like green iron or ideally even green steel. But even if you take with a large grain of salt that a whole bunch of countries around the world have committed to net zero, the odds are that the global demand for coal and gas is probably going to go down. And as a result, Australia is going to have a huge hole in its trade balance sheet. And this is where the superpower thesis kind of emerges from, right? Because this is our best, it's not just our best hope. Frankly, it's our only hope. We're this, as a country, we are not, we're not building a professional services industry. Tourism's not going to be enough to fill that gap. There's no other option when you look around the table other than these green commodities and energy opportunities. Likewise, if we don't get our resilience right in this country, or we don't get our transition to clean energy right, it's going to, as I said earlier, grow the divide between the people of Australia. So we've really got to make sure we get these challenges right. And then, therefore, what I try and do in the book, and the reason it's called Power, Prosperity and Planet, is I try and trace the three big transitions as I see it in this country. So the transition to clean power, how we transition to a new form of economic prosperity, and what the hell we do as one of the countries that's incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, what we do to bolster our national resilience. But to look at those three challenges through the prism of, if I was a middle-income household in Australia, how would I look at this debate, and how can we better frame this debate for those households? And second of all, how do we design policies that actually do that actually meet people where they are right now? Which is, I like to say that the book hasn't just got hopefully a lot of nice poetry and prose, but it's got some real tangible policy ideas in there. And just to give you a bit of a flavour for some of those ideas, when I talk about our power transition, I make the point that Australians all love to chest beat about how we are a nation of solar. We've got 4 million households in Australia now have rooftop solar panels. 10 million Australians go to sleep each night under solar panels. We've got 600,000 home batteries now in the country. Over 400,000 of those have been installed basically in the last 12 months as a result of the government's new subsidy scheme. But what we don't talk about is overwhelmingly that's a story of people who own their own home, because that's the people that will benefit from those installations and those subsidies. And there's a whole bunch of people who have never owned or don't own. By the way, that includes me, never owned a house in my life, who don't benefit from those policies and those subsidies. So we've got to find a way to make the policy design work better for them. And I talk about in the book, for example, about how we could have point of sale incentives that would mean that over time, more and more of the housing stock in this country would actually have rooftop solar and batteries. We could do it through, this book came out in March, by the way. So when I make the next comment about reform to the depreciation schedule of investment homes, you'll appreciate that I wasn't kicking into the wind of a debate about capital gains tax at the time. It hadn't yet been proposed. But the point is that there are relatively minor reforms that could happen that would actually help incentivise investment properties to actually also take up some of these subsidies. I also write in the book a little bit about EV policy, which, as Stephen said at the very start, is going absolutely gangbusters in this country at the moment as well. I say this as someone who, having just moved back 3 months ago and ordered our EV then, only just got it delivered on Saturday. But we still have a huge amount of roadblocks in this country when it comes to EVs. And by the way, those roadblocks are only going to get more acute now that everyone is ordering one because of the cost of fuels in recent months. So, we need to do more in terms of charging infrastructure, including changes to building codes to allow EVs to be in garages and so forth. We need to do more to have better financial products that allow people to factor in the cost savings of having an EV into the loan product that they may choose, and things like that. When I talk about the prosperity debate, some of the specific policies that I talk about there are really how do we rebuild confidence in a lot of our in a lot of the cities which are effectively built or concentrated around either our fossil fuel export industries or our coal-fired power station communities. And as work of the Superpower Institute has shown, they're actually also the industrial centres which have the most to gain from a green export agenda, because they've got a lot of the other infrastructure in place that really helps with that. But I talk about things like wage guarantees to help make it real for workers in terms of protections as they go through the transition of working in one industry to another, and not just to make it something that sounds conceptual, but make it something that sounds actually real and practical. And just quite quickly, when it comes to the planet section and resilience, it really struck me that, and perhaps like many of you, if this group came together after the bushfires, when I wrote this book at the very start of the year, I wrote it at a time where a bushfire ripped through Harcourt in country Victoria, which is pretty close actually to where I grew up or spent half my childhood. And it destroyed about 50 homes for people that remember it. And about 2 weeks later, by the way, there was a great flood or rapid flood in Victoria on the Great Ocean Road, which swept a whole bunch of cars into the ocean, which I remember thinking at the time, it feels like Australia is living in the passages of the Bible. You're going from one disaster to another. But it really struck me that as a country, we've in many ways become immune to the fact that we are leapfrogging from one disaster to another. And that we're doing that at a time where we also, frankly, have an insurance crisis in this country. We've got 340,000 homes in this country without insurance, most of those in the north because of cyclones. We've got about 500,000 more, by the way, who are underinsured. That in itself is a big problem. It's a big problem around where I am now in country Victoria. And unless we can, fix that problem, and B, incentivize people to also enhance the resilience of their own home, in addition to energy efficiency and renewable energy upgrades, then we won't, as a country, also bolster our national resilience. So I talk a little bit in the book of different insurance models that could help give life to that kind of policy, and also different insurance models based on the example of California, which everyone might recall from the very start of last year, where probably the state had gone too far, in fact, and actually completely disincentivized any action by the private insurance market, so much so that it had created an insurance bubble that was unsustainable. But I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour for some of the ideas in the book, which, as I say, try to trace these three big challenges, these three big debates as I see them. Think about it a little bit differently from perhaps a lot of the literature in this space, because it's designed to appeal to someone, as I say, in a middle-income Australian household, and then talk to actually policies that would meet them where they are. Love to take your questions, but also really encourage you, if you can, to pick up a copy of the book. And I'll post the link in the chat, but it's published by Monash University Publishing as well.
Right. Thanks so much, Tom. I've read the book and I agree. It's well worth a read, everyone. So good to hear all the different ideas that you come up with in the book as well. Just in terms of, getting some of those implemented, obviously, it's going to need a lot of government support in many cases. And I know you're very well connected in that space as well. I mean, what's been the, what do you, is the political courage there, do you think, to make these changes that you're putting forward?
Yeah, I mean, I write at the very end, because I write at the very end of the book that I fully recognise that basically I've made a whole bunch of proposals that cost a government more, and made no proposals about how you would necessarily fund them, which, Bathan's work is much more sophisticated in thinking about both the upstream and downstream challenge for a government. The good news, I think, though, is that look, a lot of these are not drastic policy changes, right? They're kind of the natural flow and evolution of how I think our policy debate needs to proceed. And the reason I say that is that one of the ways that I talk about in the book is that the next wave of energy and climate policy making in this country, I think, needs to be much more deliberative. And what I mean by that is, up until now, where we've really been on a journey about trying to get to, large scale use of renewables and large scale renewables pumping through our grid, which is, around about 50% at the moment. We've almost kind of had to take an approach of just doing what we can, right? We're now in a very blessed phase in a way, but also a much harder phase, right? So, our achievement of emissions reductions targets has just got actually a lot harder because it's much harder to squeeze the final juice out of the lemon that we need to. But it's also why I think we need to be much more deliberative. Large scale programs that target lots and lots of people, but also lots and lots of people miss out, is not necessarily the path, I think, that is going to either A, achieve the climate outcome, but also B, achieve the social outcome. And that's why I think being very deliberative about who we're missing out on here will help. The final political comment that I'd make, though, is that I also think that this is just smart politics, not just smart policy. And the reason that I think that is a couple of reasons. One is that I've effectively spent my adult life growing up in the climate and energy wars in Australia, and there's no real sign in this country of that stopping. And I think part of the trap that a lot of progressives in this country have fallen into is not necessarily thinking how you diminish the propensity for those wars to continue to take place, as opposed to just fighting it again on its merits. And what I mean by that is, my view is ultimately people will take action if it is in their inherent self-interest, irrespective of their ideological disposition, right? I don't care whether you think the world is flat or round, whether you think renewables are a vast Chinese conspiracy or not. You will often still install solar panels on your roof if you see the economics stack up for you, or in fact, if you see your neighbour do it, irrespective of your voting intention. And therefore, if we can find a way to actually get more and more people who aren't naturally disposed to wanting to necessarily leap on these subsidies and leap on these opportunities, to be better supported as part of this transition, then I think over time it actually ameliorates the opportunity for these debates to take place. I'll give you a really good example. A couple of months ago on Insiders on a Sunday morning, Andrew Hastie was interviewed. Now, if you're all here at 9 p.m. on a Monday night talking about climate and energy, you're probably all religiously up at 9 a.m. on a Sunday watching Insiders. But he was asked about the cheaper home battery program. And within the space of about 60 seconds, he tried to and then failed to confect a conspiracy about it of unknown origin. But I actually think if the coalition was to come to government in the foreseeable future, which I'm not sure is a bet that I'd take right now, but if they were to come to government in the foreseeable future, in an environment where 400,000 households now across the country have just installed a battery, and probably every other household has a hint of jealousy that they could have access to this scheme or afford the outlay that falls on them. It means that there's an inherent group of people who are the natural evangelists and defenders of that scheme, right? So you kind of tinker with it at your peril. And this is the point I'm getting at. Not all of those 400,000 people will necessarily be Labor voters, will necessarily be climate and energy zealots. So what you've got to do is just use very good policy design to show everyone the benefits of action in this space. And over time, I think that ameliorates the opportunity for those wars to continue.
Thanks, Tom. There's so much we could delve into further on that topic. But we just wanted to ask you one final question. It's slightly different to what we've been talking about tonight, but just in terms of the upcoming COP31, you've obviously had so much experience with the COPs. What are the opportunities that you see emerging perhaps behind the scenes, and that might be for Australia or more widely.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I spent quite a bit of time last year focused on COP31. So look, the first comment I'd make is we can window dress it as much as we want. It's a massive missed opportunity that we're not hosting the thing. And I think that's a real disappointment and should not have been the case. With better diplomacy, we should have prevailed in that battle. And the reason I think it's a real shame we're not hosting it is that it was $1 billion economic opportunity for Australia, not in terms of tourism and how many AFL grand finals worth of participants would come here, but it was a huge opportunity to actually showcase Australia, to do a whole bunch of trade deals off the back of it related to these sort of industries, and actually I think would have been a catalyzer ultimately, therefore, for our achievement of our emissions reduction goals. Now, we've ended up with this sort of slightly esoteric role as COP31 president negotiations, which has never existed before, and power to the government in terms of what they do. I think there's two things worth keeping an eye on. One is there's a big political push gathering steam, which I've had a bit of a hand in helping seed around electrification at the moment globally. And the government and the Turkish government, as the hosts of the COP, have been pretty clear in terms of wanting to see this as a real outcome come the end of the year. Now, there's a difference between whether that is a negotiated outcome or whether that's an outcome more in the political realm of something they call the action agenda. But they're also pushing a little bit on an open door in terms of government support for this. And there's a lot of talk about whether we actually need a specific end-use electrification target, which would probably be around 35% by 2035 if the Australian government got their way. The other one to keep an eye on is, Australia is technically doing its role in partnership with the Pacific, which again is all very well and good, but we've lost a big opportunity not actually having the COP in the region as well. But there's a big push, which I've been involved in, around trying to secure a landmark initiative around 100% renewables in the Pacific. That would make them the first region in the world to go 100% renewables, by the way. And a lot of these countries in the Pacific already have 100% renewables targets as well. What they often don't have is the match support from donor countries to get there. The good news is, because we're talking about, in most cases, some relatively small places and actually not huge amounts of gigawatts, is also wouldn't necessarily cost a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. And the lived benefits of that are enormous. Not just, it's a minuscule amount of emissions, as I referred to earlier. But it means things, for example, that if you're a very small Pacific island, if you've got 100% renewables, you can do things like extract more from your own supply chain through things like canning your fishery, fish on island, rather than transshipping it to a third country. That means more government revenue. That means more government expenditure on services for your people, and hopefully less donor aid generally over time. So there's some real lived examples of the benefits of that kind of transition as well. So I'd keep an eye on those things.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. That's been fabulous. So really appreciate you covering off the book and obviously the questions following that. And as I said before, highly recommend everyone. We'll put it, when we send the summary around, we'll put a link to Tom's book as well. But thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.
Really good to have you with us, and thanks again, Beethan. So just to sort of draw things up, I hope to close, I hope everyone's really enjoyed the session this evening. It's been fascinating, and great to see Beethan and Tom sort of complementing each other as well in what they've been saying. In terms of our next environment session, it's on Monday, August the 17th, and our speakers will be Michael Berkovich. Michael is Executive Director of Climate Resilience Academy at the University of Miami in the US. And he's also a founding principal of the global NFP Resilient Cities Catalyst. And he's going to be talking about, giving us a perspective on US perspectives on climate resilience. And we also have Professor Ross Gordon, from Change for Good Institute in the UTS Business School, speaking on their recently released paper on microplastics. So again, fabulous session coming up. As always, if there's anyone in your network that you think would like to join our group, they would be really, really welcome. So do encourage them to sign up via the website. We're always wanting new and more members to keep growing our group. And I hope to see you all again next month. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you.